Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. But I didn't retire. My friend, I'll call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees, including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's co-workers, I'll call her Hester, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a longtime nuisance employee. Among other sketchy behavior, Hester was always scamming ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. In order to make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours/pay by supposedly going into the office in her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her own lies on a number of occasions and being warned about trying to claim for unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Hester or get rid of her. The reason being is the owner discovered after she'd hired Hester that Hester had actually been fired from her previous job at another travel agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Hester had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping on Hester and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Hester, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off, and she established an official no overtime policy. Hester would still try with her shenanigans, but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Hester still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. In order to avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Hester would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Hester wasn't coming in. Despite this happening a number of times, Sandy would usually let it slide since there was now a definite no overtime policy. Therefore, Hester could no longer claim to come into work on the weekend or after hours in order to try and make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Hester not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 work days just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Hester and the other employee, both verbally and in writing, that they could not book time off for the dates in question since she'd be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. This is when she discovered that only the day before, Hester had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to visit Las Vegas, as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary, where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the date Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Hester had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning she'd discovered the travel Hester had booked for herself and her daughter, Sandy emailed Hester telling her she would have to deny her the days off since she'd already been told they were unavailable because she, Sandy, would be away and needed Hester in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Hester replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Hester she knew about the trip she'd booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, that Hester's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Hester the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Hester countered in her subsequent reply, without even addressing the fact that she'd been caught in a lie, that she'd been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years and couldn't understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she'd done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire and was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Hester's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that without making any mention of Hester's threat to quit/retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Hester. Also aware of Hester's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she'd been looking for with Hester, and she had it all in writing. He told her that Hester had essentially resigned/retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Hester's desire to do so, let her finish out her 2 weeks, or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu with no further severance pay legally required since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went into the office early, accompanied by her long-term boyfriend to act as a witness. She put Hester's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Hester was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards, which had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee had arrived for work, and they all waited for Hester to show up. Hester arrived just before 9 o'clock, acting as though nothing had happened, and greeted everyone with a "good morning" as she walked through the door. However, she was apparently taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's boyfriend seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Hester was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further and that she'd accepted Hester's notification of retirement. She then handed Hester a check compensating her for the hours she'd worked in the current pay period, as well as 2 weeks' wages in lieu of Hester finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Hester was dumbfounded and went into panic mode. "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire." Sandy responded that indeed she had retired, given her notice, and had proof of it in writing. All Hester could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employees who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Hester's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Hester quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was property of the business, contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Hester take it. Hester's shock had now turned into obstinance, and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's boyfriend had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Hester to just leave. Sandy then informed Hester that if she didn't leave, they would have to call RCMP, Canadian Police, at which point Sandy's boyfriend dialed 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ Travel Agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and Hester immediately ran to the door, ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client info. In order to de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Hester to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Hester was not legally entitled to this box of client info. The other officer then re-entered the business and told Hester to wait outside. He said that Hester was insisting that Sandy was holding on to her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who'd spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Hester's property. The police officers then picked up the larger box of Hester's personal belongings, took it outside to Hester, and told her she needed to go home. To rub salt in Hester's wounds, the next day Sandy put up a large sign in the window of the business congratulating Hester on her retirement, and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on the piece of revenge cake was Sandy, when filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired, retires, made sure to check the box labeled "retired" for the reason for Hester no longer being employed. By doing so, Hester was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits. And our next story. Are you happy? Quit gang stalking me. So there's a shoplifter that always comes into my store. The last time we tried to kick her out, the police took 2 hours to arrive, and she spent the entire 2 hours flipping out and screaming at us. She's disgusting. Has sores all over her body, meth mouth, hacked off blonde hair, the whole 9 yards. She's stolen a ton of stuff from us. We have proof, a trespass order, and though we've tried to be extremely nice to her in the past, she just couldn't stop getting her fix. She came in today, and this was the first time I'd been on the clock for her post-tantrum shenanigans. The other managers are somewhat cowardly when it comes to suspicious persons. I, on the other hand, take delight in pissing them off. Now, I deal with a lot of meth heads, and I happen to know the best way to piss off a meth head is to make them paranoid. So she comes in with her boy toy, looking especially methy since the last time I saw her. I say, "Hey, nice to see you again. I'll be right around here if you need any help." And I give her the trademark stare. You know the one that every mid-level, underpaid, overworked manager gives that chills you straight to the bone, as though Satan himself just shook your hand. She nods and keeps looking through the overpriced apparel. You know, the ones that have the curvy check mark on them. You know, the ones that everyone comes in and rips the censors off of? But I digress. I stand right behind her, 5 feet away, and I stare. She starts wigging out a little, puts a bunch of thin, easy-to-fold and stuff-in-your-pants clothing in her arms, then walks over to a different department. I follow behind the whole time, just staring, not saying a word. She starts whispering to her boy toy. "Look at this B-word. We're being gang-stalked right now. This is gang-stalking. I'm being gang-stalked." She picked up another piece of clothing. High price. Censored. I just follow, don't say a word, just stare. She moves to every department in the store. Every single one. The whole time I just follow behind her, staring. I can tell she's at least sober this time because she's speaking in coherent sentences. She's telling her boy toy that I'm a B-word, that I'm a whore, etc., etc., etc. Nothing I haven't heard before, lady. So she walks by me and says, "This is harassment. You're harassing me. I could call the police on you. What you're doing is wrong." I just smile and said it's my store. Turns out I can stand wherever I want and keep staring. Finally, she gets fed up, slams her armful of merchandise on our front counter, stomps over to her bike, tells her boy toy, "We are leaving. I'm so sick of being treated like this. Look at her. Look at her smug face. She's still watching. Look, lady, I'm not stealing anything. Are you happy? Quit gang-stalking me." And she left. Manager with nothing better to do, 1. Meth head, 0. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.